Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we are doing yet another one of these. I won't do a review for this book because I'll do it on Count the Classics someday type of video. About 2.5 years back in October of 2022, I read American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, whatever it's called, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And about a month afterwards, I did a video kind of like wrapping up my spooky season reading for that year, in which I briefly reviewed all 3 of the books, but then I did a separate review for American Psycho after the fact because I felt like it deserved a review, and then Rebecca and Haunting of Hill House I never really intended to do this type of review for. But then it was about, 2 years ago at this point that I started reviewing the classics that I was reading in this format anyway, because I didn't think that Count the Classics would ever actually be a thing, that I would ever, get around to doing it. And that was basically the case. So here I am, more or less finally getting to some of the last of these videos that I need to cover in such a degree. We already did Rebecca a couple weeks back, so now it's time for Haunting of Hill House. Let's begin now with the good of The Haunting of Hill House, in my opinion, what I remember from when I read it 2.5 years ago. The first thing and the most memorable thing about the book for me was that the tone of it and the dialogue, the general character interaction really stuck with me over the years. This is not least because of my having grown up with watching Abbott and Costello stuff, which ran like the 40s and the first half of the 50s, basically, when they were a big thing. This book came out in the late 50s, so something about the tone and general character interaction just kind of felt authentic to that era of America, even though this isn't necessarily doing anything comedic. There are things about it that come across as comedic, the way that I remember enjoying a lot of Abbott and Costello stuff when I was young. So I don't know if that comparison makes sense to everybody who's read the book and who's also watched any of that stuff, but something about that really worked for me and made the book click. Even if the events on the page weren't necessarily the most exciting thing, or if it was just like building up the story in the beginning, for example, the general tone of the book really sold me. And even as things, grow into being a little bit more horror later in the book, the tone as that shifts and changes, the dynamic of that is still really enjoyable as well. So I definitely respect that about Jackson's work here. As such, relatedly, I would say that the imagery of Haunting of Hill House is very good. It's quite evocative. I would say it's also enhanced by Jackson's general style, because the book is a great slow burn. It doesn't drag out too much. Of course, it's pretty short in here, so there's not much time to really waste in that degree. So it's a slow burn that doesn't drag itself out too much, has great tone that shifts and kind of changes, and the imagery of the book entire is evocative. So you have just a general coalescing of a bunch of elements that really work to make this book come alive in the reader's mind, or at least it came alive in my mind. In fact, I still remember a lot of mental images from the book. The imagery is so evocative that much of the book still sits in my head even 2.5 years later. It's been a little while and I haven't thought about the book a whole lot since then, but thinking about the book now, I remember a lot of stuff quite well, so that's gotta be quite the compliment. I would also say, as far as the slow burn aspect of Haunting of Hill House goes, the character interactions, kind of as I talked about them before, the back and forth between characters as they're kind of like arguing and trying to determine what's going on and what precisely to do about it, this really enhanced the way that the book sold its own tone to me. As things get more unsettling in the book, as things get more unsettling for the characters, the way that those characters react kind of reflects that of the reader. Jackson's execution of that in particular really worked for me, and was perfectly spaced for my tastes. And also, as far as this being a horror book, the particular brand of horror was great for my tastes, I would say. It's not reliant on monsters or ghouls, but rather frights and discomfort. So you have a little bit of a different type of horror than I think I was expecting going into it, and that ended up being a really good thing because it it didn't subvert my expectations per se, but it kind of did something different than what I was expecting, but didn't offend me in doing so. It was great. particularly because the questioning of sanity of the characters felt pretty real and never really felt forced to me. And Jackson's style, once again, to bring this up, really enhances this. I would say that Jackson's prose is very engaging and falls in service to the story, so you end up with a pretty smooth and easy read, despite this being a late 50s novel. But for the bad of The Haunting of Hill House, I don't love everything about this book. I would say that my copy in particular, I don't know if this is consistent with all of the different various versions of this book that exist, but this version of Haunting of Hill House, at the very least, the Penguin Classics version, doesn't denote character thoughts in like italics or anything, and I know that not every book does. Most books tend to kind of make things a little bit less confusing on this front. But I really noticed that in The Haunting of Hill House, the main character, Eleanor, thinks to herself a lot throughout the book. It's not a first story book, but there's enough of her first person internal dialogue going on in it that, like, you could say that half of the book is in first person, and probably wouldn't be wrong about that description. There's so much of this stuff, yet those thoughts are never really denoted. So this made bouts of monologuing and whatnot quite jarring every time it happened, and it happens a lot. So that's a criticism as far as like the formatting of the book is concerned, not necessarily on the content. I got a little bit of whiplash at times because it's like, oh, we're suddenly in a character's thoughts halfway through a paragraph, and that happened quite often. I would also say that the ending of The Haunting of Hill House is somewhat abrupt. It's not fully satisfying to a degree that I think everybody's going to love. I found the ending pretty thought-provoking myself, and also fitting for what the book overall is doing, but I think that most of those I read this book with at the time as a read-along in October of 2022, I think that most of those people disagreed with my personal sentiment about the ending. I don't think that all those people disliked it, but I don't think very many people that I read it with found it as fitting as I did. So there's definitely a chance that the ending isn't fully going to work for you, but I think that everything else that comes before that is totally worth the journey, even if you don't like the ending. Like I said, I liked the ending, so it wasn't a problem for me, but I could see it being a problem for some readers, because it was for some of the people I read it with. Also, I could totally see the ending just being underwhelming as a whole, not necessarily that it's like bad, but just being underwhelming. I could see that being the case for plenty of people. In fact, to some degree, it was underwhelming to me at the time, but thinking about it over the months afterwards, I was like, I think that's fitting, and I liked it about that. For the ugly of The Haunting of Hill House, I would say, if this book doesn't click for you, it's really not for you. Like, you're not going to like this at all if nothing about it clicks for you. And obviously, that makes sense. Like, oh, if it doesn't click for you, it doesn't click for you. How obvious, Casey? But the point is that if you don't click with this book pretty early on, there's a chance that you're just not really going to like it overall. I don't recall there being many naysayers as a whole in the read-along that I did with this, or the read-along that I participated in of the book, but I do recall one person outright scoffing at 4-star and 5-star ratings of the book, because it's like, it's good, but like, it's not that good type of thing. And I would say that that's actually a fair assessment. To be honest, I think that that person wasn't necessarily wrong. I wouldn't argue with any rating from 3 to 5 stars for The Haunting of Hill House. I think that they're all appropriate depending on what things you take to the most. The ugly is that, I have no way of knowing what you're going to take to the most. In fact, I think I initially rated the book 5 out of 5. I'm pretty sure I adjusted it to 4 out of 5, and again, I wouldn't argue with 3 out of 5. The Haunting of Hill House is a particular vibe. That much is definitely true. If that vibe doesn't click for you, because it's not going to click for everybody, it's probably not going to be a book for you overall. I think especially folk closer to my age will be prone towards disliking it. Again, a lot of the reason I enjoyed it was because it reminded me, for some inexplicable reason, of Abbott and Costello, and nobody my age is watching Abbott and Costello. So, there are things about this that probably aren't going to click for younger readers in particular, but maybe they will because of the Haunting of Hill House show that they did on Netflix, that Mike Flanagan did. I understand that it's not the most faithful adaptation or anything like that, but if that's kind of thing that you might enjoy, I I recommend the book. So that jumps into the recommendation itself. It's hard to say whether I recommend the book or not in total, but because it's short and I enjoyed it, I do recommend it, like I just said. But it's also hard to recommend because I do think it does have a particular audience. So, I'm going to be pretty wishy-washy with this review and say I give you no particular recommendation. I'm inclined towards recommending it, but, depending on yourself and your own tastes, I would go into this with, expectations of what you're actually going to get, pretty settled and accurate to what the book is actually going to be before you jump into it. And if you're pretty confident that you're not going to be someone who likes it, I would say you don't need to. I'm not going to require this. If you are not a fan of classics as well, I guess this is another point I could make. If you are a fan of classics and horror classics, totally try it. If you're not really into classics at all, I don't think that the horror aspect of this is going to drag you in to overcome kind of the age of it. It doesn't feel particularly aged, but it's aged enough for sure that if you're not into older stuff for whatever reason, this probably won't click for you. So make the decision over whether you read this book for yourself. I think I personally recommend it, but I'm not going to argue with anybody who says they don't either at the same time. Hopefully this review didn't absolutely suck. I apologize if it did, and I also apologize that it's a little bit shorter. Like I said, now I can cross this off of the backlog of reviews that have been needing to be done for a couple of years at this point, and now all of my Spoopy Season 2022 reads have their own reviews. American Psycho I reviewed a couple years back and really loved that book. I really recommend American Psycho, actually, but you should watch that review before you take that into consideration. Take everything else into consideration with it. Either way, I'm rambling now at this point. Check back in next month as I review my outstanding Spoopy Season 2023 reads. I'm looking forward to doing some of those, but thank you for watching this video nonetheless. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.